Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Mark Hutchinson. I'm Vice President of Green Building Programs at the Canada Green Building Council. Today, we're very excited to be launching CAGBC's newest study, Decarbonizing Canada's Large Buildings, a Pathway Forward. Now, before we get underway, a few housekeeping matters. The optimal view for today's session is the side-by-side speaker view, and you can select that by clicking on the view option in the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom screen. We appreciate your understanding that while today's session will be recorded, the recording won't be made available for distribution. So today's rules of engagements are to please keep your audio muted, that's first. Second, to save bandwidth, please keep your cameras turned off. And finally, direct any questions that you may have to the chat, and these will be answered at the appropriate time throughout today's session. Although we are logging in from different locations today, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we are on and the communities who have been living on this land. The land I'm on in Ottawa is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people who've lived here on this land since time immemorial. And it's now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to be present in this territory. And if you're interested in learning more about the territory you're coming to us from, we'd encourage you to visit www.whos.land. Today, we'll hear about how Canada's retrofit market can be supercharged, and we'll unpack the insights that owners and policymakers require to begin deep carbon retrofits today. First, we will hear some opening remarks from Thomas Mueller, President and CEO of the Canada Green Building Council, the Honourable Mona Forte, Member of Parliament and President of the Treasury Board, as well as Nixinos, Executive Director at the Centre for Greening Government. Following the remarks, we'll then proceed with a review of the report and some of its key findings, followed by an engaging panel discussion to provide some perspectives on achieving successful deep carbon retrofits. And we'll, of course, have opportunities for questions and discussion throughout the session. I'd like to first acknowledge our project partners for their contributions and collaboration, without whose help this research and today's session wouldn't be possible. The sponsors for our research were the Government of Canada, the Real Estate Foundation of British Columbia, as well as Nova Scotia Energy and Mines. And today's session sponsor is PCL Construction. So a big thank you to all of them. I would now like to introduce Thomas Mueller, CAGBC President and CEO, to open our session. Thomas, over to you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for the introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to take a few minutes to set a bit of a context on the Council's involvement in the building retrofit agenda. We have invested in building retrofit for the last 5 years. It started in 2016, actually, with our first report positioning buildings as a climate change solution. And it became pretty clear that retrofit, particularly retrofit of large buildings, is going to be critical for us to achieve our climate change targets. And then in 2017, we released our roadmap for retrofits in Canada, where we still kind of started working on the case for retrofit in more detail. That was followed by another roadmap the following year, where we started to talk about some of the barriers and some opportunities that we identified that kind of were barriers to helping us, scale up retrofit in Canada and actually establish a retrofit economy. But back then, kind of the stakes were a bit different. We still worked on a 30% reduction by 2030. Of course, we all know this has changed now. We talk about 40, perhaps 45% by 2030, and then getting up to 100% when it comes to carbon by 2050. And that's really consistent with the global goal. COP just ended a couple of weeks ago. Our global body, the World Green Building Council, has very clear commitments to zero carbon that we support. Buildings need to be 100% zero carbon operationally. and 40% by body count by 2030, and that is then 100 and 100 by 2050, and that includes existing buildings as well. So it's a significant and a massive challenge to scale up deep carbon retrofits. In Canada, that means we need to look at 100,000 buildings and about 1.2 million residential units across the country. That means basically that we have to retrofit about 30,000 buildings every decade, at least 30,000 buildings every decade to low carbon, possibly zero carbon performance. It's a significant challenge. And you will hear today that there is a positive business case for doing that, for energy efficiency retrofits and carbon retrofits, but the progress remains low. And you know, there's a common recurring theme I'm hearing in the industry that we're just going to wait till the grids get greener. Well, we actually can't. And if the grid's going to get greener, which is a great thing, and it's happening across Canada, you still need to have the right equipment. You still need to have a way more efficient building than you have right now, and able for us to electrify the building sector. There was an estimate here in British Columbia. I live in Vancouver, as some of you might know, and they say that we're just finishing our Site C dam up in the north, the second big dam, and we have very clean electricity in BC. But if we electrified our building sector here in BC and transportation, we would need 3 more dams to accomplish that. So the challenge of doing that is quite significant. And efficiency will play a critical role. The barriers, and we're always very good, you know, all of us identifying the barriers, and with the solutions, we often struggle with those. But you know, the barriers when it comes to retrofit are economic, the market barriers, the financial barriers, and just competing priorities in the industry, in the building industry and in the investment industry for deep carbon retrofits. But with the report today, Decarbonizing Canada's Large Buildings, we're actually laying a path out for building owners and developers, a path forward. And that also includes decision makers, of course, and how we're going to decarbonize our large buildings. If we do that, and then we have the added value, the added benefits of having healthier buildings and having more resilient buildings. The fact is, if we want to get to this target, the target that we have set ourselves, the 40 to 45% reduction GHGs, we need all hands on deck. There's not one solution that will take us there. But we know that retrofit is the key solution, and we need leadership from government, on policy, on regulations, on funding and financing, in particular on carbon pricing. Carbon pricing needs to continue to be more aggressive. And finally, we also need the private sector to be on board. And you have to be all observing there's massive shifts actually in finance led by institutional investor towards a net zero and a low carbon economy here in Canada and actually globally. Now, with these opening remarks, I would now have the pleasure to introduce the Honorable Mona Forte, who has provided us with a welcome message. The Honorable Mona Forte was first elected as a Member of Parliament for Ottawa-Vanier in 2017 and is the first woman to represent this riding. She has previously served as Minister of Middle Class Prosperity and Associate Minister of Finance, where she drew on her expertise in the area of healthcare, education, job creation, and Francophone affairs. As a mother of 3, a University of Ottawa graduate, a community leader, and an entrepreneur, Minister Forte knows that it is important to come together with an ambitious plan to build stronger and better communities by growing the middle class. Please welcome Minister Mona Forte via a video message. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Thomas. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Malgré que je ne puisse être avec vous en personne, je tenais à souligner le travail et la recherche que se fait pour la décarbonisation de nos grands immeubles. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am joining you virtually from Ottawa, which is on the traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples. First of all, I would like to thank the Canada Green Building Council for your leadership. Like the Government of Canada, you are taking real action to fight climate change. Now, we must go further and faster, and we all need to work closely together to achieve our sustainable development objectives. The Government of Canada owns and manages the largest real property portfolio in Canada with 32,000 buildings. And we know buildings account for 50% of federal direct greenhouse gas emissions. And that is why our greening government strategy and its objectives rely on the substantial decarbonization of these federal buildings. That being said, it is easy to understand why our partnership with the CAGBC for a study on decarbonizing Canada's large buildings was so important for our government. This study will provide owners and investors across Canada and beyond with a clear financial case for investments and retrofits of existing buildings. Pour les nouveaux bâtiments et les rénovations majeures, les ministères fédéraux doivent s'assurer de donner la priorité aux opérations à faible émission de carbone et résilientes au climat. Nous visons donc à ce que tous les nouveaux immeubles fédéraux respectent ces critères. Nous insistons aussi pour que toutes les rénovations majeures fassent l'objet d'une analyse du coût du cycle de la vie sur la réduction des gaz à effet de serre en utilisant un coût fictif de carbone de 300 $ la tonne afin de déterminer les économies de GES optimales. Enfin, tous les nouveaux projets de bâtiments, les rénovations majeures et les infrastructures doivent maintenant comporter une évaluation des risques liés au changement climatique. Nous nous engageons aussi à nous assurer que nos locations-bail soient zéro émission nette et résilientes à partir de 2030 pour tous les bureaux loués par le gouvernement. For us, the study aligns with the Centre for Greening Government's mandate to provide leadership towards low-carbon, resilient, and green government operations. Our goal is to achieve net zero, climate-resilient real property operations by 2050. And ideas that we can apply now and that help us reach our goal faster are always welcome. In a few moments, the Centre for Greening Government will provide more insight on our activities to green our operations and how this study will enable us to leverage the findings into durable actions for a real property portfolio. As I thank the Council for your leadership in taking on this important study, I also want to recognize the great collaboration on this project between the Centre for Greening Government and other federal government organizations, including Public Services and Procurement Canada, Natural Resources Canada, and the National Research Council. I also want to recognize other partners that help fund this study, including the Real Estate Foundation of BC, the Nova Scotia Department of Energy and Mines. And finally, thank you to the report consultants, RDH Building Science, working in partnership with Dunsky Energy and Climate Advisors. This is the moment for bolder climate action, and as I said earlier, there is strength in numbers. Working together to achieve our common goals is critical. And I thank you all for your participation in today's event, and as I look forward to the benefits and outcomes of this study on decarbonizing Canada's large buildings, not only in our federal portfolio, but across the country. Merci. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Minister Forte. I would like to introduce now Mr. Nixinos to provide an introduction to the report. Mr. Nixinos, or Nick as I call him, is the Executive Director of the Centre for Greening Government within the Treasury Board Secretariat of the Government of Canada. So for those of you that are not familiar with the Treasury Board Secretariat, this is the agency within the federal government because everything that the federal government does. And Nick is responsible for greening government operations. The center is working with the federal departments across the government and agencies towards zero carbon, sustainable, and climate resilient government operations. Previous to this position, Nick has worked on climate change, impacts and adaptation, Arctic science, space policy, and infrastructure policy. Nick has an MBA from Dalhousie University and a Bachelor of Commerce from the University of Ottawa. And I'd like to finish by saying is that under his leadership, the Government of Canada announced a very forward-looking, future-oriented plan for its portfolio of buildings that was announced at the end of, just about a year ago, at the end of 2020. And as far as I'm concerned, this is an ambitious plan to convert the portfolio of buildings owned or leased by the Government of Canada to low-carbon performance. And is the best plan to date that we have seen in Canada to tackle climate change at a portfolio level of buildings. So please welcome Nixinos. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Very appreciate the opportunity today to say a few words. and very excited about the study and the results. I think we're really, when we started this case, and you heard our minister outline our commitments in the greening government strategy to decarbonize our own portfolio buildings, get to zero carbon by 2050, 40% by 2025, sorry. And then we developed the strategy of how to get there and what we need to do. And one of the first questions we had by portfolio owners was, by departments that own big portfolios of projects was, it's hard. Does the technology exist, and how much is it going to cost? And so we set out to work with like-minded partners like CAGBC and others to say, okay, well, all owners of big portfolios are having these kinds of questions, right? So how do we get the information we need, get the analysis we need to accelerate this action? Because we've heard, right, it's urgent. We need to move, and we need all hands on deck. So we've developed a strategy, and often you think of the federal government in terms of overarching, across all our levers of all policy levers, et cetera, to green the built sector. But I want to focus a little bit on our built environment ourselves and what we could do as owners of 32,000 buildings, as our minister said. On sait que tous nos édifices vont être ici en 2050. La plupart des édifices vont être ici. Alors, on a une opportunité de décarboniser nos édifices et d'avoir l'information qu'on a besoin. Et cette étude-là nous supporte beaucoup dans ce domaine. So we approached the CAGBC with many others and said, how do we need to know the information to get more information, more economics around what's it going to cost us, what's the benefits, what's the life cycle, look at this. And we know it's complicated because there's a lot of different kinds of buildings in a lot of different parts of the country. And the federal government's kind of a good test case because we have buildings, all kinds of buildings, from hangars to office buildings to warehouses to residential, and we have it all over the country. So this is a really welcome study. We really appreciate the in-depth analysis and work. And it'll inform us as owners of buildings, but also inform us as the federal government looking at all of our policy levers. So this is a really helpful piece of work and study. So really appreciate it. I'll say a few things, I guess, couple of things. So our commitments, as you've heard by our minister, like our plan really is, how do we, basically we've outlined very specific requirements in different areas. We've said new builds need to be zero carbon, retrofits are going to use a shadow price of carbon at $300 a ton, as the minister said. We want to look at life cycle investment over 40 years. So, people would come to us and say, yeah, but it's going to cost me 10, 20% more upfront to build a greener building. But we said, but what's the cost over the life cycle of the building? And that's what matters to Canadian taxpayers, right? And to the environment. And we knew that we had to couple it with the portfolio plans of departments, because as the study showed us, if you couple the deep decarbonization with the retrofit of the building at the right time, when that's going to happen, then you get two birds with one stone there. So we've moved in these areas in the greening government strategy, and I'll just mention a couple other things. We've asked departments to come up with zero carbon resilient portfolio plans, so that all departments are moving in the same direction. And we're also really interested in embodied carbon. So what's the carbon in the construction materials that we use? So all of these areas are really interesting. Leases, we want to get to zero carbon leases as well, as mentioned. So you've heard sort of the overview of what we've done. We needed the data and the analysis to support the action we're taking, and that's what today's study that we're going to hear more about gives us. And so we're really happy to hear about it. I'll leave it there, and I'll just, I guess, say that I think for all of us working on greening the built environment, I think we need to understand that we need urgent action. And also when we touch a building, the economics of a building is that when you retrofit a building, you have that one shot at it, because you're probably not going to deep retrofit it often. So think about that in terms of how you deal with your portfolio. And I look forward to hearing the rest of the session today. Really appreciate the good work done by CAGBC and its partners. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. And with Nick's remark, I will now turn it back to Mark to take us through some of the report highlights and recommendations.
Great. Thank you, Thomas, as well as Nick and Mona. For the presentation today, I'll be joined by Steve Kemp, Principal and Senior Energy and Sustainability Specialist with RDH Building Science, as well as Patricia Lightburn, Senior Consultant with Dunsky Energy and Climate Advisors. Steve specializes in net zero carbon buildings, and he uses energy modeling to inform design teams on how to achieve their design goals. He's also a member and the former chair of our Energy and Engineering Technical Advisor Group, and I have to mention that I just love how he can diffuse the most tense discussion with his laughter. Patricia is a seasoned project manager who's delivered a diverse range of projects focused on building decarbonization, clean mobility, and renewable energy, including the Canada Infrastructure Bank's $2 billion commercial building retrofit financing initiative. She always brings a smile to project meetings, no matter how early it is on the West Coast or how many hurdles the project is facing. And lastly, I'll be inviting Levi Higgs, Senior Energy Advisor with the Canada Green Building Council, to chime in during the Q&A in case we're struggling with any of your questions. Levi really lived and breathed this report more than anyone else at the CAGBC. Finally, just a reminder that if you have any questions throughout the presentation, please post them in the chat and we'll address them at the end of this section. These are the lovely presenters who will be joining me today. And I'll start by briefly introducing the objectives for the research that we set out in our early discussions. The first objective was to identify deep carbon retrofit pathways for a selection of building architects. Secondly, to determine the business case for deep carbon retrofits, including both the upfront costs and life cycle returns. And finally, to look at the barriers and highlight opportunities and policy levers to support increased retrofit activity. In terms of the scope of the project, we identified 50 building archetypes. In terms of building types, there were 5 different building types, from low-rise and mid-rise office to low-rise and mid-rise MERBs, as well as primary schools. And we chose these because these represent a significant portion of the large buildings in Canada. In terms of vintages, we specifically looked at buildings from the 1970s and buildings from the 1990s. As Nick mentioned earlier, and I believe Thomas as well, it really makes most sense to consider a deep carbon retrofit when you're already investing in the building as part of regular renewals. So a building from the 1970s is likely to be considering a building envelope renewal sometime soon. And the assumption was that a building from the 1990s is likely to be looking at some significant improvements to the mechanical systems. Finally, we looked at a number of cities across Canada that represented different electrical grids, as well as obviously different climate zones. With that, I'll hand it over to Steve to walk us through some of the core results.
Great, thank you, Mark. So I'm going to walk you a little bit through of what the process was, as well as the core results. Of course, we're trying to get all of these buildings to a net zero carbon scenario. That includes offsets from on-site generation, so they all included PV on what the available roof area likely was. We also had to put a fair amount of time trying to understand what we think the current building stock looks like for these buildings, both in the 1970s and the 1990s. We don't have an extensive database in Canada for commercial buildings for that. We do for residential through the EnerGuide program, but not for commercial. So largely we did that through expert surveys, which means phone a friend. You called out people that you knew worked in Calgary, or sorry, Edmonton, or in Halifax, in Montreal, and we asked them, what are you typically seeing for a school, a MERB, an office building in your area that was built in the 1970s or the 1990s? What does the enclosure performance look like? What kind of mechanical systems are you seeing? And basically had to make a choice because we can't model 10 different mechanical, we didn't have the budget to do 10 different mechanical systems in each one of these scenarios. So we made a choice. And so in, say, the 1990s MERBs, we have a lot of electric resistance baseboard convectors. In Ontario, for the low-rise offices, a lot more rooftop VVT systems. In Halifax, in one of the 1970 buildings, we saw office buildings, we were recommended that we use a dual duct constant volume system. So there's quite a smattering of different starting points. And then we had to develop a transition plan for all of these. While finding the most cost-effective solution was not part of the study, we certainly use a certain amount of engineering judgment to try to keep costs within reason. If it was already a hydronic heating system, it remained a hydronic heating system. If it was a VAV office building or a constant air volume office building, we still use that ductwork. It may have converted the constant air volume to a VAV system, but largely we tried to keep our retrofits to the central plant, the enclosure for the 1970s buildings. And in the case of the 1990s buildings, almost all of these, we switched to some type of heat pump. We didn't assume everyone could put a ground source heat pump in, so we said, okay, air to water heat pumps. On that case, I think we were living 5 years into the future, meaning yes, low ambient air to water heat pumps are available in Canada, but they don't go all the way down to, say, -20 and -25. So a lot of these buildings had gas backup to deal with those coldest days. And what I mean by living 5 years in the future, we pretended they were available in slightly larger sizes than we can currently get, but that technology is rapidly changing. Then we, of course, did all the modeling to figure out what would happen. In the case of the 1990 buildings, we did have one challenge, and you'll see that definitely in the life cycle costing. By going to heat pumps, we're going to low temperature. And if you're not upgrading the envelope, we're significantly reducing the capacity of baseboard convectors and fan coils to heat those spaces. And therefore, we also assumed in the 1990s case that all of those would have to be replaced in the building to be compatible with the low temperature. We assumed only some of them would need to be replaced in the 1970 buildings because they were getting significantly better enclosures that were dramatically reducing their peak heating capacities. And then Dunsky started looking into the delivery methods, and I'll leave discussing that to Patricia a little bit later, and exploring financing options. How do we make this go forward? Mark, the next slide, please. So here are some results. This is an information-dense slide, but the headline are the numbers on the top. Those are the % reductions in carbon emissions for each one of these buildings in the 1970s. You can see, especially in the clean grid provinces, the combination of the clean grid and the PV, we are seeing, almost 100%, high 90s% reductions. We're seeing, of course, less in the Edmonton and Halifax. Their grids are not quite as clean today, although they're getting cleaner in the future. We use today's grids for all of these. That said, because they started at a higher level of carbon emissions because of their fossil fuel-based grids, electrical grids, the magnitude of total tons avoided per building is significantly greater in those provinces by going through these retrofits. So again, in this case is the 1970s. This is a full retrofit of the enclosure. We're moving people to AAA's windows and high levels of insulation. And of course, a complete conversion of their heating systems to all electric with heat pumps. And as I said, with some peaking gas boilers where needed, as the heat pumps don't go all the way down to the low temperatures that we need yet. But there's precious few of those hours. So you can see, especially in, say, Toronto and Montreal, we're still seeing very high percentage of GHG reductions. And again, the PV is offsetting some of that. Next slide. Here are the same results from the 1990s. Generally, you can see that most of these buildings started off at a better place. Between codes and retrofitting the buildings newer codes of these buildings. Sorry, most of them are starting off in a better place, but not all of them. Generally in MERBs, we're seeing, although the windows got better from the 70s, we started putting more windows in buildings. So these 1990 buildings were more likely to be all window wall as opposed to built up construction for the MERBs in the 1970s. But again, the same kind of pattern is prevailing. We can get to very high GHG reductions, not quite as high as with the enclosure retrofit, but very high. And again, same pattern, less savings in the high fossil fuel provinces. You can see, for example, in Edmonton, we still got very high for the primary school GHG reductions. The primary school was largely a one-story building, so lots of room for PV to offset that and that kind of building typology, but less so for the taller buildings. Move on to the next slide. And here are the, for both all the scenarios, the energy reduction. This speaks a little bit to the impacts on the grid. We did do a peak electrical demand from the grid analysis as well. And definitely when you do the full retrofit, the impact, including the enclosure with the 1970 buildings, much less impact on total electrical demand. That's because we're reducing the heating demand so much by the better windows, the better, adding ERVs and so on. Less of an impact when you do the full retrofit. More of an impact on peak grid demand in the 1990 buildings, obviously. This also speaks, of course, to operating energy savings. So go ahead to the next slide, Mark. So we can finally start talking about, well, what is this going to cost and what is the payback? So first I want to mention, we did include the planned carbon tax up to $170 a ton in 2030. And then we asked the Treasury Board, what's going to happen after 1970? And they told us to use $300 a ton, escalating to that by 2050. So make of that what you will. I will take it as a sign of where carbon pricing has to go in this country. And I'm now talking to clients at $300 a ton. All the green dots, those are the ones that are above the line. They have positive net present values. That is that they pay you back. A lot of them here in Halifax. Halifax is kind of blessed with high natural gas costs already. So they already have it's not really a carbon tax built in, but they already have a high cost starting off with space heating. Although I will say a couple of these buildings in Halifax were actually still oil heated. We made that decision, again, trying to figure out what was typically happening. If you're in the central core of Halifax, the gas grid is there, and most people have switched to it. But if you're not in the core, the gas grid is not there. And then some other places where the price differential between natural gas and electricity is as a variable, we're not seeing as good. Next slide. So now we're moving into the 1990 vintage buildings. And you can see much fewer green dots. Again, that's a reflection that we're not going quite as deep in our retrofit. We're not doing the envelope upgrades on these buildings, because they're not due for an envelope upgrade yet. So a little tougher challenge there just on the finances. That said, if we move on to the next slide, we did calculate what that carbon abatement was. So even with the carbon tax, anything here with a $0, they were a green dot already. They were above the line in net present value. All the other ones, what is it going to cost you? What is the cost per ton of carbon avoided over that life cycle to achieve near zero carbon? And most of these numbers aren't crazy. There are some high ones here, but 140, 80, 150, $200 a ton. Those are the types of numbers people have been talking about for a long time as the cost of carbon and the social cost of carbon. Move on. Here is the discounted payback. So think of it as a simple payback that includes all the time value impact of money. Again, you can kind of see that Halifax one. I'm pretty sure that was the constant volume air handler one. And also the fact that we have a high cost of fossil fuels in Halifax. That gets you into the 5-year payback, but most of these are over 15 years. And that means we do need a time, we do need a mental shift to do this, we need to think about long-term investment and longer payback periods to achieve this. And then that's why the carbon tax is going to help. And of course, it's already baked into this, but possibly even more of a carbon price to adjust this. And also, we didn't include the fact that the grids are planned, so we didn't include the future grid decarbonization. So hopefully, as the grids decarbonize, that'll hold the price of electricity more steady compared to natural gas. Next slide. Oh, I got lost. Where are we? Are we moving back to Patricia?
I think we are.
I think we are.
Steve.
Okay. I think Marky, yeah,
Unless you wanted to say something else.
Marky laid a slide on me, actually, but okay.
All right. Well, I wanted to go through some slides. We, as a group, we discussed, what do these results mean of this financial analysis for actually speeding up the pace of deep carbon retrofits in the country. So we looked at what are the barriers really standing in the way of accelerating the pace and ramping up the scale. And we grouped these barriers into three primary buckets. Economic barriers. So Steve just really talked about those in depth. We saw that cost effectiveness is a challenge for some of these deep retrofit projects, but some of them have a pretty solid business case. The discounted payback period also varies across the country, as well as we saw that the absolute incremental capital cost associated with going that extra step when you're undertaking these retrofits could be a barrier for some building owners. We also see a number of market barriers, including lack of awareness. So this is, on the building owner side, policymakers as well. And this is not just lack of awareness about the opportunity for energy savings, but also making that shift to thinking about carbon saving. When we look at the return on investment compared to the hassle factor, that can definitely be a barrier for a lot of building owners. There's also a split incentive challenge where potentially the benefits of the deep carbon retrofit don't necessarily accrue to the party that's making the investment. We also see performance skepticism. So undertaking retrofits of this depth is relatively new in the market. There's not a lot of good data. Maybe the technology is new. So definitely potentially some hesitancy there. In terms of whether these retrofits are actually going to deliver on the savings that are committed. Related to that is first mover disadvantage. So again, not a lot of these projects have been undertaken at this depth. And so, whether the technology is new or there's a lack of data, it can be hard to be the first mover. On the financing side, while we hear a lot that there's cheap capital in the market, although maybe that's changing these days, it's whether that financing is really well suited or attractive or well designed to suit the specific needs of deep carbon retrofits. Steve mentioned those longer payback periods. That's one example. Uncertain risk profile. So financial institutions are going to look at these investments and see what is the risk that I'm undertaking and what is the impact of that risk going to be on capital costs for financing. High loan transaction costs. So how difficult is this project to undertake compared to the potential value? And then also challenge related to on-balance sheet debt and the potential for competition with other, the core business of building owners. So we next looked at, given all of these barriers, what can policymakers do to overcome these barriers and help building owners move the needle forward. Sorry, this is a little bit small on the screen for some of you, but we grouped these potential strategies and policy mechanisms into three buckets. Regulatory mechanisms, so this could include incentives, local requirements, energy rating and disclosure policies, which are becoming more and more common across Canada. Could also include performance requirements or retrofit codes, as well as the main lever, which is carbon pricing. In terms of financing mechanisms, we've seen a lot of activity in this space over the past couple of years with PACE programs specifically designed for commercial markets. We're also seeing on-bill financing offerings, as well as different forms of credit enhancements offered by government. We saw over the past year, the Canada Infrastructure Bank launched their commercial retrofit financing initiative, which we really see as a big opportunity in this space. Other support strategies that are really important as well could include public procurement. So we've heard already about the Government of Canada's commitments, as well as demonstration projects, retrofit support services, and general education and training. So capacity building among building owners, contractors, service providers, really across the board. And I hope that the PowerPoint is not restarting. Yes, it is. All right, well, maybe we'll give it a minute. But I guess that the last point that I wanted to make on that slide is that each of these mechanisms plays a different role in the market in overcoming different barriers. And unfortunately, there is not one silver bullet that will solve all of these challenges. I mean, carbon pricing is really maybe the closest thing, but it's not going to do it on its own. So we need a combination of different tools and mechanisms across all different levels of government to make these retrofits a reality. And Mark, I can continue going by memory if you like.
Sorry, everyone. I'm not sure what happened there. It just literally shut down and rebooted, and I'm trying to get us to where we need to be. It should just take 1 second.
All right. Well, why don't I continue and see what I can remember? But I think that the next slide was really about the status of these policies and support mechanisms across different jurisdictions in Canada.
You're on track.
Perfect. And so what we see is in different provinces, different levels of ecosystem maturity in terms of policies and supports that are in place to support retrofits. And in particular, again, something that we looked at was supporting retrofits, not just in terms of energy efficiency, but also in terms of carbon savings. So you see here both the Efficiency Canada scorecard, which is a really useful resource for those of you who haven't looked at it, which gives an indication of policies and support mechanisms in place. We looked at the status of rebates, CPACE programs, OBF programs, building energy rating and disclosure programs, as well as codes and performance requirements. And while you see that certain provinces we've marked as, in terms of ecosystem maturity, as high or medium and high, so BC, Nova Scotia, Quebec, Ontario, for example, there's a lot of blank space on the map here. So there are not a lot of full circles, which means we're really good to go. A lot more work is needed in terms of supportive policies. This is still a relatively new area for policymakers, and there's an opportunity definitely to do more. And with that, Mark, I think I'm going to hand it back to you.
That's great. Thanks, Patricia, and thanks, Steve, as well. You and your teams really did great work for this report, and I'm very grateful for all of your efforts. Now, before we get to the questions, I want to try to summarize some key takeaways. This is only my perspective on things, but I think the first thing that we know is that the goal is clear, 0 by 2050. And we've shown that we can reduce fossil fuel use by at least 93% and often 100% using technologies that are readily available today, or as Steve said, perhaps imminently ready. And the GHG reductions associated with that are very significant, often 100%. And when you think about that, that's really incredible. It's a huge opportunity for our industry to take action on climate change, really show leadership, spur some new markets, new technologies, and make Canada a leader. So where do we start? As an industry, we need to commit to developing transition plans for each and every building, outlining how each asset is going to decarbonize over time. Now, we don't need to have all the plans ready next year or even 5 years from now. As we heard, we just have to make sure that each building has a plan ready well in advance of any planned capital investments in mechanical and envelope systems in particular, so that the upgrades can be integrated into spending that's already going to happen. Now, planning is the first step, but putting the plans into action is next. We need to prioritize envelope upgrades far more than we have historically. We really have to look at enclosure upgrades as one-time opportunities to drive down heating demand and help boost the business case for decarbonization. And we also need to leverage the incredible efficiency of heat pumps in particular that run on clean electricity to help, again, strengthen that business case and slash building emissions. And as Steve said, it's not that all buildings should or even could get away without fossil fuel heating for our coldest nights today, but heat pumps really are the most important tool that we have in our toolbox to get at significant reductions in fuel consumption. In terms of the business case, we saw that 45 of the 50 archetypes had a positive return, which is, again, fantastic. And it really speaks to the unique position that our industry is in to meet the challenge of climate change. A positive return might be all that's needed for someone like an institutional owner to get buy-in. Unfortunately, we also saw that less than half the archetypes had a return of over 5%, which gave them, a positive net present value. That means that for many commercial buildings, it will be hard to make the business case for a deep retrofit today. Of course, the good news is that carbon pricing means that a retrofit done next year, 5 years from now, is going to have a built-in stronger business case because of that escalating price. And we also know that technology that's helping us to decarbonize our buildings is rapidly evolving. So I think at the end of the day, it really is an exciting time for designers as well as for owners who are committed to their decarbonization. Now, we know that each building is likely to only have one, maybe if you're lucky, two envelope or mechanical system renewals before 2050. That means that we need to get going today. We can't afford to miss opportunities like these when they come up, even if they're tomorrow, 6 months from now. We need to figure out quickly how to address the barriers and supercharge the retrofit activity in the marketplace. That means that we need to look beyond the technical solutions that are summarized in the first column on the left. As Patricia said, we need to make sure that the market is informed. We can also increase our capacity to deliver retrofits through education and training. We need to support the market with incentives and financing mechanisms, for example. And finally, we need to make sure there's a floor, in other words, a minimum for building performance and for retrofits in the future. I hope that I've summed up some of what we've learned and expressed some of my excitement. I think we've seen more progress on carbon mitigation in existing buildings in the last 3 to 5 years than really we did in the last 20. And it's great to see all of you showing interest in the exciting trajectory that we're on. I'll turn it over now to Thomas for some closing remarks. Thomas?
Thank you, Mark. Great event, great discussions. I really enjoyed all the presenters today and the commitment to finding out how we can move forward. And I think that's probably how I wanted to close, is that the focus does have to be on implementation. I think that the issues around implementation, transition planning, and what I think it was Sarah who said that is we have to start now. Because I think even if you look at taking you back to COP26, so there was the Paris Agreement 5 years ago. They came back 5 years later and they realized that actually not much has happened in 5 years. And I would think that we simply do not have that luxury anymore to wait in 5 years increments just to observe, then we don't do anything or very little. And I think we know, and again today, I think it was a great report and great discussions. I think we know what the what is. What we have to do is how are we going to do it now? And in a way, our systems that we have established, societal systems, are probably the biggest barrier to that. It's that lag in the system to getting things done, because we always see risks and barriers and threats that we think that are too risky to take, perhaps. On the other side, I would say, I live in BC, and if you had just had the BC floods, you get a bit of a different perspective that BC had a terrible year, from the heat dome to flooding now. And now, of course, it comes out that we haven't really invested all that much in resiliency, and now these municipalities that have been flooded are expected billions of dollars over the next 10 years to build up the dikes and the flood controls and those types of things, just so that people can continue to live in floodplains. And I think so. I think that we have to really think about how can we implement, and we don't have to get the perfect in the way of the practical. And I think we really have to move forward now to think about how can we transform entire portfolios of buildings over the next 10, 20, and 30 years, and how we strategically invest in these assets to get them to low or zero carbon performance. And again, our financial system is misaligned with climate change. Short-term returns for a long-term problem that we need to solve. But these are not insurmountable. And I have a big hopes actually in a shift on how this whole finance sector, pension funds particularly, think about climate change and how they are starting to see the risk. And that corporations are starting to go beyond the kind of Milton Friedman paradigm that companies only exist to make profit. Actually, the new paradigm is with the emergence of ESG is that companies also need to have a purpose. And the purpose is what is the value and the purpose that that companies provide to citizens in Canada or the US or globally. What's your purpose other than making a profit? And so I think the investment in the report again showed that, as you said, Mark, it is profitable to invest in retrofit. Just so we know that it's profitable to invest in green buildings, in LEED certified buildings, where we have thousands now in Canada. As we showed, it's profitable over the life cycle. Over 20, 25 years, it's profitable to invest in new zero carbon building in most instances. So we know enough to move forward. And I think we need to, in order to address the climate threat, we need to take more calculated risk in moving forward and actually working on the solutions rather than having as the report showed what the solutions are, work on solutions rather than letting the risks keep us from moving forward and just not moving fast enough to address our challenge by 2030 and by 2050. But great discussions today, and thank you all for your time, and also for the sponsors and both of the report and of the event today for supporting us, CAGBC, and helping us moving the needle forward. Thank you.
And with that, I'd like to thank our presenters and our panelists once again for their participation today. For more information and for a copy of the summary report, you can visit us at www.cagbc.org/decarbonize. Again, cagbc.org/decarbonize, as you can see on your screen there. Now, the full technical report will also be posted to this site in the next couple of weeks. Thank you again for everyone who's attended. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you again in 2022. Take care.